Yes, we have three tiers. Archive. There's something called archive tier also. We'll come back to that. That's what I'm coming back to. So two things I'll come back to. What is archive? What is, let's say, how do you apply something at a container level? But until here, any questions, I'm just taking that and just I'll move let's say to that particular topic.
Sir, I have a question.
Go ahead, please.
Sir, out of these 9 sample files, how would an admin get to know that this sample 1 or 2, 3, 5 is the most frequently accessed?
Again, I'm not, let's say, I'm not, let's say, telling that I'm not, let's say, what do you say? I'm not analyzing each and every blob which is being frequently accessed, but I'm sampling everything together. I'm sampling everything together, and I'm saying, let's say, for example, sample 5 is being frequently used. Sample 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9 are not being frequently used. In my case, let's say I'll put it in that way. Vasan, can you please go on mute? I'm just getting a little echo. I can just explain your question.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. So let's say sample 5 is being frequently used. Now, when sample 5 is being frequently used, the date stamp or the time stamp of the last modified will be constantly keep getting updated. So this blob will never move into cool until the frequency of usage reduces. So this will still stay in hot, but the rest of your blobs will move into cool if they are not being frequently used. Again, this is something that I'm letting Microsoft take care of. So let's say this blob is being used again and again, very frequently being used. So the timestamp on this will be keeping the timestamp on this one will get frequently updated. And if this is getting frequently updated, the rule will analyze what is the timestamp that I'm looking at, what is the last modified date, and when the rule runs, will it says okay fine, is the last modified date greater than 30 days? If no, then this blob will never move into cool. This blob will still stay in hot. And the rest of the blobs that are not modified for a period of, let's say, the next 30 days, that will move into cool. So it completely depends upon the frequency of your access. That's how your lifecycle management will, kind of get into application.
So, if I
Okay.
understand correctly, uh,
Hmm?
the frequency of accessing a data, it's from the admin's perspective, not from the end user perspective.
Correct.
Thank you, sir.
I mean, even as an end user, if you access this, the timestamp will get updated. So it's both the end user and the administrator, both of them.
Got it. Thank you, sir.
So I'll just take, I'll, yeah. Azure decides when to trigger a rule. Azure will trigger a rule every day. Azure for every 24 hours will execute that rule. Provided there is one scenario out here is that when you create a rule, it will take 48 hours for that rule to come into action. And after 48 hours, meaning from the 29th of, let's say, June, Azure will trigger this rule every day. Frequently, it'll trigger this rule every day. For every 24 hours, it'll trigger the rule. It'll check for all the blobs that are falling in a condition, call that 30-day period, and then modify the life cycle on top of them. Yes, any more questions, guys, offline? Anyone, any more questions that I can take before I move forward? All right. So there is one more question that was asked is that if I change the tier, there is something called hot, there's something called cool, and finally there is something called archive. What exactly do you mean by archive? What is the use case scenario of an archive is this? Now, here's what it is. Even though if my blob is sitting in a tier called cool, let's come back into the, let's use this calculator to understand a couple of things out here. Again, I'll just delete this out. I already have a storage account. So I delete this out here. I'll again add a storage service, and let me change this pricing to INR. And here you have hot, cool, and archive. So if I put it in hot, the cost of the storage is around, let's say, 16-13 rupees. If I put it in cool, the cost of the storage is actually getting reduced to, let's say, 1179 rupees out here. If I put it in archive, do you see there is a drastic change between how I store my data? Again, I'm talking about 10,000 GB of data. Sorry, 1000 GB of data out here. For 1000 GB of data, if you are in hot, the cost is the highest, 16-13 rupees. If you are in cool, you are still paying something, but a lesser price when compared to hot. But when you put your blob in archive, cost is the least. It's the least cost that you have. So what I do is that now I'm telling that if I just want to store my data without giving an access to you, meaning if I just want to store it just for archival purpose, the term archive is storing. So if I just want to store it, I can just click on this. I can say change the tier and I can say to archive and I'll say save. What happens out here if that is that if your blob is in an archive tier, Microsoft just treats it to be a storage and this blob will get inaccessible. Now it's my browser where it's loading all these things, but let me open an incognito window and place the URL of this particular blob. Though my container is sitting in a container level access, it's not a private access. The blob will not be available out here. Meaning you cannot access your data that is sitting in archive. Example, in our case, let's say you are a newspaper agency. You can from the newspaper portal access, let's say, a newspaper that is 2 years old, not more than that. If you want to access something like that, or let's say you are going to a bank and you are telling them, you know what, I need 5 years old data. I need a transaction that I did today 5 years ago. Can you give me the data? The banking website or the bank will tell you that, you know what, give me some time. I cannot give you the data rightly available. Give me some time. You need to give me some time. Also, you need to pay a service charge. I mean, if you want to try it, go to a bank, ask them that, you know what, I need a data which is like around 5 years old. They'll tell you need to pay a charge, some amount of charge you need to pay to me, and you need to give me some time. The reason being, if you want to access an archival data, the bank would have by now put all your data into something called archive tier. They would have archived all your data. And if you want to access a data, you need to rehydrate the data. What do I mean by rehydrate it? Is that you need to change the data from an archive into cool or hot so that you can access it back again. And if I do this, this is called as rehydration. And rehydration will have a charge. Depending upon the priority that you have, standard or high priority, you will have a charge. It will also take some time depending upon the size of the data that I'm trying to rehydrate. So when I'm saying rehydration, it just means that I'm converting my tier from archive to cool or hot. This will have a charge, this will have a cost. This charge is what the bank is charging you directly, telling that you need to pay something like this is a service charge and etc. This is what they'll pay to the cloud provider, and it's now telling rehydrating pending to what, hot, so that the data can be available. And this will take some time. What is the time? Azure doesn't tell you. It just tells you that, you know what, I at least need minimum of 30 minutes to a maximum of 7 to 8 hours depending upon the size of the data that I'm trying to rehydrate. And once the data is rehydrated, that's when it will again be available for you. Until then, you will still get the same error. You'll still get the same error out here. If you're trying to access that particular data, you'll have to wait for some time and then kind of rehydrate it out. Also, when you look at the lifecycle management, you can add one more rule out here called archival rule. What I can tell to Microsoft is that, you know what, all the blobs on which the date modification is greater than 365 days, 1 year. If it is more than 1 year, if the last modified date is more than 1 year, change the blob to what? Archive. Instead of cool, I can say archive and I can add this out and I can save this out here. Archive. So I can add one more rule out here. So I can add multiple rules out here and I can add hundreds of such kind of rules. The maximum capacity is 100 rules out here per a storage account. I can add 100 rules out here. Now let's say that you have multiple containers. Someone asked that, what, I have multiple containers out here. I'll say test container 2. Container 1 needs to have a different life cycle. All the blobs that are in container 1, they need to, let's say, follow a life cycle of 30 days to cool, 365 days to archive. Meaning after 30 days, move all the blobs in a container called test container 1 into, let's say, cool. And after 365, move it to, let's say, archive. But in container 2, probably I have some sensitive data and I want this container 2 to follow a different life cycle altogether. Probably I want all the blobs in this container to move into cool, not after 30 days, but after 90 days. Move into archive, not after 365, but after 730. Can I do that? Yes, you can do that. Again, by using the life cycle concept. But this time around, I'll change it slightly a little bit. I'll say rule 90 days. I'll add a different rule out here. And now I won't apply this rule to all the blobs in my storage account. Rather, I'll limit the blob with something called as a filter. I'll now add something called as a filter out here. I'll say next. And now I'll say if the date is modified is more than 90 days, move it to something called as cool. I'll say next, and now it's asking me what is the filter you want to add. Here I'll say it is test container. This is a filter, meaning if you see blobs under this particular test container, please add this rule and not the above one. Now I have a rule called 90 days, which is only applied to a blob which is under the test container out here, which is under, let's say, this particular test container out here. And I can go ahead, I can add one more rule telling archive 730 or archive, let's say, something like 900 days. After 900, please go ahead and archive this out. Meaning roughly around 3 years, I'll put the blob. After that, it'll go into archive tier. I'll again say limit the blobs with filter. I'll say next, I'll say 900 and I'll say archive this out. And I can say this is container. I can add multiple rules like this. I can put multiple rules like this. Let's say I want to put one more rule called delete. After, let's say, something like 1200 days, I want to delete the data because that data is no longer significant for me. I can also put a delete rule out here. I'll say limit blob with filters. I can say next. I can say if the days modified is more than what? 1200, delete the blob. I can also have this particular condition and I can do an apply filter out here. I can say a test container 2. I can only apply this rule for a particular container called test container. I'll say add this out. I can add this as well. So I can have multiple rules that are working together with each other. I can also add filters to a rule telling which container that particular rule gets applied to. And if you want to also, let's say, apply blob filters, meaning let's say inside a container called test container 2, inside a container called test container 2, if you have blobs, let's say starting with A, B, C and all that stuff, you only want to apply rule to all the blobs starting with a letter called A, you can also do that. If you go inside a rule, you can say filter set, you can update the filter set telling that, what, test container / A, all the blobs starting with a word called A or all the blobs starting with a letter called B, something like that, and you can update the rule out here. So you can achieve this kind of granularity with these rules and apply them to certain blobs, all the blobs or certain containers inside a blob, and you can add multiple rule sets that are working together with each other as such. This is what you can do with lifecycle management. And most of the clients that I work with, most of the projects that I work with, which use a storage account service, will definitely use a lifecycle management as such because they want to manage the blob. Because I'm not just talking about data which is in MBs, I'm talking about data which is in GBs, which is in terabytes and etc. And we would like to manage how we handle the data. We would like to manage, or we would like to cut down the cost out here because everything that you do is directly related with the price. as and when the price, or as and when the storage goes up, even the price goes up. So we would like to manage how we want to handle the blobs. We would like to, let's say, get down the costs in a very optimal way. Reason being, you have something called as a life cycle management out here, and you can apply multiple rules as such. Yes, any questions still here? Anyone, any questions still here that I can take? I'll allow you all to unmute yourselves. Yes, go ahead, please. Anyone? Uh, will it cost anything to rehydrate? Yes, it will cost you to rehydrate. And the cost, it's not directly exposed, but you will have a cost. You will have, let's say, a rehydration cost. You can visit the documentation out here telling Azure Blob rehydration cost. Will give you the entire thing on what is the rehydration priority, what is the cost that you will incur for a rehydration, and all these things out here. So if you can look at the pricing here, this is what it will tell you, that what is the cost associated with rehydration. So it depends upon how old is your blob, how big is your blob, and all these things. Based upon that, Microsoft will calculate the rehydration cost out here and give you something called as the cost for rehydration as such.
Hello.
Yes, anyone, any
Hi.
question? Good,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah. Kiran, I mean, let's say
I
like,
mean, let's say like,
I
Sorry, I
think
am.
there is some
Yeah,
echo.
go ahead.
Yeah.
Now it
So,
is
I
good.
mean,
Please go ahead.
yeah, let's say like there are 100 files in a container blocks.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
I mean, all of them are falling under a rule which you have set for some life cycle management, but you want
hmm
to exclude 10 of them. Is there any way
Okay.
we can do it?
Can you exclude 10 of them? Definitely yes. But you will need something called as a tag for those blobs. So let's
Okay.
say there is something called as metadata key value pairs out here, something called tags out here, blob tags. You can
Okay.
tag them saying exclude is equal to true.
true is equal to true.
Hmm.
Just a second. Yeah, exclude is equal to true and etc. And then apply a filter out here telling that if the blob doesn't contain this particular tag. So if you look at the lifecycle management out here,
Okay.
you can also, let's say, go ahead and give some filter sets out here. Inside the filter
Okay.
sets, you can say the key value pair is equal to,
Mhm.
not equal to, and give the value out here,
Oh,
and you can
yeah.
exclude certain blobs out such
Mhm.
as such.
Okay. So we can use tags for like excluding or
Correct. You can
any
use
other
tags
kind.
inside a blob while you create it.
Okay, thank you.
Is any more questions, guys?
Excuse me, Kiran.
Uh, Sorry,
How
just a
do we?
second. I'll just, sorry, Tulasi, just give me a second. I'll just come back to you. Just taking a question offline. Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay.
Cool is storage purpose, but if the data is in cool, you can still access it. The data can still be accessible, meaning a blob in cool, you'll still be able to see it on, let's say, if you go take the URL, you'll still be able to see the blob. Though you'll get some cost, you'll still be able to see it. In archive, it is completely for storage. Even in cool, you are paying. There's no access. In archive, it's only for storage. There's no access out there. Tulsi, please go ahead.
Yeah. Like we have opted multiple rules over here, and
hmm
how do we know like which rule is for what? Like, is it a readable? For example, if you
Uh,
open a rule one,
right.
like how do we know this rule is for this and this rule is for this?
So one way to identify easily
Mm.
is that
Yeah.
there is something called as a list view. There is something called as a code view. Now, if you click
Okay.
on a code view, what Microsoft does is that Microsoft gives you a JSON body out here. We'll talk about what a JSON file is and all these things out here. And if
Mm.
you look at this, here it is in a
Okay.
readable format. You'll be able to see that, okay,
Okay.
fine, the rule here 30 days. And here the filter
Okay.
set is all the blobs out here. Let's say the rule
Okay.
something called as 90 days. It's only applied to a container called test2. There is another rule
Okay.
called 1200, which is only applied to something like this. So this is how you can read that particular rule as such.
Yeah.
Yes, you can edit here. You can edit here as well. Meaning, if I say this is 7:30, and I
Oh.
can say that this is archive like 7:30 out here. Let's say
Mhm.
7:30, and if I save this out, it will still work. Even the list you see archive 7:30 got updated. So you can edit here or you can edit here. Anything works.
Okay.
Right? Any more questions,
Okay.
guys? Hmm?
Hi, Kiran.
Do
Good,
you have
please.
any graphical representation for this usage and all
Graphical
for better
representation, no,
understanding?
not as of uh, graphical representation for the rule, for the rules. Sorry,
Storage.
uh, as in the entire storage account. I didn't get you. Like, what exact
Yes,
graphical
yes.
representation do you look? Again,
Entire
if you
storage
look at a
account.
graphical, yeah, for an entire storage account, if you look at that, let's say go into the resource group out here. Let's say storage RG. If you go into the resource group, there is something called as resource visualizer. If you just click on this, it'll just tell you that there's a storage account, but inside that it won't give you any graphical representation as such, but it'll give you some kind of a diagrammatical representation of your resources that are sitting inside the resource group. It'll just tell you what is a resource, but you cannot go inside this, and you cannot, let's say, look for that particular, let's say what, let's say if I go here, or let's say if I go here, there is no resource visualizer out here. So you'll have to, let's say, manually come down into your containers and look at what your containers are and all these things as such. Yes, any more questions, guys? Anyone, any more questions here?
Uh, Kiran, I mean, how do we know how much they're using? I mean, let's say test container one, how much it is using, like out of 1000 GB, how much it is using? Let
Or again, 1000 GB is just the ideal capacity that I'm giving. I'm not, let's say, mentioning what is the capacity of my storage account. But if
Yeah.
you want to, let's say, look at the usage of it, you will
Mm-hmm.
have to, let's say, switch yourself to the Microsoft Storage Explorer, which will give you a very good, let's say, kind of thing, or a representation on how it uses. That is one thing that you can do. Or if you just go to your storage account, there is something called as Storage Explorer, which is browser view. If you click here,
Okay.
it will also tell you what are the number of containers, what is the total data that's stored, and all these things out here. Again, it's just loading right now. It'll take some time to, let's say, show you all these things out here. So if you go here, it will tell you what are the containers, how many containers are there, and etc. In a couple of minutes, it'll show you what are the number of blobs and how much is the total data that is stored and all these things out here.
Okay.
Yes, any more questions, guys? Anyone, any more questions? Good, please. Correct. Not really. If in a container you have 100 blobs, after 30 days, will the first 50 go to cool? No. It depends upon the frequency of usage of all those 100. So Microsoft will evaluate each and every blob. It will see how frequently they are being used. If they are not frequently being used for the last 30 days, everything will be moved into, let's say, cool. So it completely depends upon the frequency. Yes, any more questions here, guys? Anyone?
Yeah, Kiran, one more thing.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, please.
In a subscription level, I'm able to see my role as a global administrator,
Okay.
not in a owner role.
Mm-hmm. Reason
How do
being,
I see? Yeah.
yeah, sorry. The reason being, your role is actually coming from the Azure Active Directory. So in something
Okay.
called as the Active Directory, there are also something called roles in the directory out here.
Okay.
Let's say if I look at my roles, and I mean, if I look at my role out here, let's say go back into users and go back into the role.
Yeah. If I check from overview,
Hmm. Yeah, you will be
yeah,
as a
here you
global
are able to
administrator.
see owner. Yeah.
Right. Reason being,
Uh-huh.
I am assigned an owner at a subscription level, but my
Okay.
actual role is a global administrator at a tenant level. You are taking the direct role. Probably you would have created the subscription. Probably you would have created the tenant. Reason being, you are inheriting the
Okay.
role directly from the tenant as such.
Is it any problem like it should be mandatory role should be an owner role or is it okay in a global administration?
No, global administrator will give you more privileges than an owner. So owner is only for a
Okay.
subscription. Global administrator is
Okay.
for a tenant. So global administrator will give you more privileges than, let's say, an owner. So it shouldn't be a problem.
Is it any extra charges if we select as a if we select that role?
No, no, no charge when you select a role out here.
Okay. Then I can go
Yes,
ahead
anyone?
and continue with the next process, right?
Definitely,
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kiran.
no problem. Someone offline had a question. Yes, go ahead. Can you add multiple containers to single? For a rule, yes, you can add multiple containers to a rule. Good question. If I have a rule, the question here is that can I add multiple containers to a single rule? Definitely yes. If you go inside this one, go into the filter set, you can say test container one as well. Block prefixes, you can add multiple prefixes out here, and you can say update here. So once you update it, this rule will now start applying to these two containers. So if you look at that particular rule called 1200, delete 1200, it's being applied to these two containers as well. So you can add multiple containers under the same rule, will work. Yes, any more questions, guys? Anyone, any more questions here?
Kiran, do we get any notification after 30 days?
No, you won't get a notification. Azure will automatically apply these particular rules. You will not get a notification as such.
Okay, thank you.
And from tomorrow, guys, we'll be starting with automation, one of the most important, let's say, topics that we are going to discuss, because this is all good. If I go ahead, I show you how to create a storage account, how to apply a rule, good enough. But what kind of a requirement you get in a real-time environment is that your client all the way, one day he comes to you and says, what, can you create, let's say, 10 storage accounts for me, and each and every storage account should have, let's say, 100 containers, and each and every container should have a rule applied on top of it, and each and every container should have blobs applied on top of it within 1 hour. I need all these things done within 1 hour out here. If such a kind of requirement, actually, this requirement really comes like, it comes like that for us. If that comes into picture, I won't be able to do it manually, because if I do it manually, firstly I need a lot of resources to help me out, because each and every, let's say, storage account, I'm talking about 10 storage account, each and everything needs to have 100 containers, meaning around 10 into 100,000 containers out here that I need to create in 1 hour, and also apply rules on top of it, each and every unique rule for each and every container as such. If such a kind of a requirement comes to you, how do you automate this without coming to Azure portal? How do you write something and then automate all these things out? That's where automation actually comes into picture. That's where scripting languages actually come into picture, and we are going to, let's say, go into something called PowerShell tomorrow. Look at a very basic of PowerShell. Let's not do high level of it, let's do very basics of it, and let's understand from that basic level that how can you apply these basics to Azure. So again, my humble request to everyone is that, though you are from a programming background, though you are not from a programming background, just tell yourself that it's doable. It is doable. Actually, it is doable. It will not take more than 15 days for you to actually master a programming language, any programming language. That's doable. It's just about the development of logic. It's development of your own logic. So my, let's say, intention here is to not give you a predefined logic, but to, let's say, help you all develop some logic with, let's say, some assignments and all these things out. So over a period of time, we'll look at what is the basic of PowerShell, how can you develop over PowerShell, what are additional resources that you can, let's say, look at YouTube or look at, let's say, different channels out here to learn PowerShell and all these things out. We'll use that, we'll go with that. So my humble request is, please stay with me for the next, let's say, 1.5 week. Don't skip classes, because each and every class is again interconnected with each other, programming especially. If you skip one, the rest will be, let's say, Greek and Latin for you. So please don't skip it. Even if you skip it, please make sure to, let's say, take the recording and look at the video the same day and practice it out. So we'll start that from tomorrow, but for today I'm done with the session. So we'll meet tomorrow, guys, and have a good day ahead today. Thank you.